right. So as Mike and Ali said, we're going to share communion in a little while together. But before we do, I was just going to share some thoughts. And I don't know what your background is, whether you grew up in the church or you didn't, but my story is that I grew up in the church. My dad is ordained. He works for the Church of England. And he's a Yorkshireman, my dad. He's the son of a Yorkshireman, that's right. And so I spent the early years of my life in Halifax in Yorkshire, where my dad was a vicar, and he was kind of one of those, or at least tried to be one of those trendy vicars. And so we had in our church a praise band. This is back in the 90s. And I can remember that one of the songs that we used to sing in this little church up in Halifax was kind of like etched onto my memory, mainly because it just was such a weird juxtaposition, the words that we were singing and what was going on as we were singing them. But I'm going to sing it for you now. That's right. And I would like those of you, this is just a song this is only the old school people will remember this, all right? If you remember this song, you have to join in with me, because as you're about to find out, I cannot sing. All right, it goes like this. You shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace, and the mountains and the hills will break forth before you. There'll be shouts of joy, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Let's keep going. And the trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands while you go out with joy. Wow. And what would happen? What happens today is that when we want to take it up a level in the worship, somebody's got like a Mac somewhere on the stage and they press a button and this track drops. But in the 90s, that kind of technology had not been developed yet. And so what they did to take it up to another level is some genius came up with the idea of, why don't we just sing this again, but we'll just sing it faster. So everyone would start going, we shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. Do you remember that? And in my church, we would have to get up and walk around the pews going, we shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. I'm there with Agnes and Mavis, and we're doing this together. And there was this one time when I don't know why, but my mom and dad decided that we were going to witness, take worship to the streets. And so we hired this lorry and put our praise band on the back of a lorry. And kind of like went through Halifax with this lorry walking behind it, singing these songs. And you know, when you're a kid, anything is embarrassing, really, especially if you're seen with your parents, by your friends, even if you're just in a shopping centre somewhere. But just imagine being seen by your friends, where you're there with your mum behind the praise band going, she's there going, we shall go out with joy. And that happened to me, and I was dying inside. And to be honest, I thought they were a bunch of loonies at the time. But looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, I think, do you know what? Maybe they were onto something. I mean, they were loonies, but maybe they were onto something as well. And this thing about joy, this thing about going out with joy, we've had quite a wonderful week, haven't we, in the last few days? It's been amazing what God has done among us. And we're going home now. And what are we going to go back with, and what are we going to carry back with us? And I think that I've been discovering quite a bit about joy over the years as I've got to know Jesus better. Because I think before I really gave my life to him, from the outside, to me, becoming a Christian looked like giving up all the fun things in life and deciding to behave and become boring. And boy, did I miss it, because actually to grow in Christianity, to grow in relationship with Jesus, is actually to grow and develop in joy. It's to mature in joy. It's for our joy to become richer and deeper and more enduring. And my tendency always is to focus on the stuff that we have to do as Jesus' people. I've got to pray more, serve more, love more, give more. And it becomes for me like a massive to-do list. And actually I forget that the heart of it all, the whole point of the good news is what has been done for you. It's what we've received from him, that we discover that there's a God who made us and who loves us and who knows us by name and who calls us by that name into relationship with him, into fullness, abundance of life. I forget that. And so because I forget it, I don't always realize that this is an adventure in joy. And if you want to kind of come on a journey with me on this, then I want to just reflect a little bit about how we mature in this and what this might look like for us. But I just want to say as a caveat, really importantly, at the start, if you're here and you are struggling with depression or anxiety, and that's your day-to-day reality, then we're talking about then the risk we're talking about something like joy, and to be a Christian is to be joyful. The risk that what can happen then, and I'm really conscious of this, is that suddenly we can begin to think, great, not only have I got struggling with depression, but now I feel condemned and guilty that I'm not able to be a happy Christian. And that you need to hear that we're talking about something different here. Depression, anxiety, I've had my own battle with anxiety over the years. It's an illness. And it's not something that we need to be condemned by or feel guilty by or have to repent of any more than you need to repent of having a broken leg. And so that's a really important caveat to understand. At the same time, for all of us, God's invitation is into joy. And it starts with, not with me kind of, this is how I usually start. Okay, I need to be joyful. I'll put that on my to-do list. Be joyful when you get home. But it doesn't actually start there. It starts with understanding at a deep level who God is, who he is and what he's like. And as we become more like him, which is part of the journey that we're on, what we're becoming and who we're becoming. And for whatever reason, we sometimes think of God as cranky and angry and distant. And actually, that's such a misunderstanding of his nature. God is the most joyful being in the universe. And there's all sorts of places in the scripture we could go to that would show us that right at the core of who God is joy. There's lots of places in the Bible that reveal that. One of them is the way that God approaches his working week. Can you imagine if God approached his working week, we hear the story of it in Genesis chapter 1, in the same way that you and I so often approach the working week. In the beginning, God's alarm went off, he groaned, rolled over, and hit snooze. And then he said, oh my word, it's the first ever Monday. Oh, what have I got to do today? I've got to make some light. Oh man. And he's like, oh, I could make kind of like, the sun and the stars and billions of comets flying around, making flashy. I could do that, but I really cannot be bothered. So I'm just going to make some like strip lights that you find in an office. And at the end of the first day, he looked at what he'd done and he said, it'll do. And it was evening and it was morning the first day. And then he woke up on the second day, he thought, oh my word, it's only Tuesday. The Sabbath is ages away. What have I got to make today? I've got to make some land. I could make really thick jungles and some rolling green hills and some mountain ranges, but I cannot be bothered. So I'm just going to make it all flat and grey and boring. And behold, the whole world looked like Milton Keynes. And he looked at it and he said, it'll have to do. Like that's so not the vibe, is it? From the story of creation. It's like God's put his heart and his soul into the whole thing, because he has. His imagination has just run riot. And so he creates this world of wonder and of light and of things that are more delicious than they need to be. He goes crazy. He's extravagant. He pours himself into it. It's an outpouring and expression. It's his handiwork, the handiwork of a God of joy. And then when he shapes his people, as the story of the Bible goes on, he shapes his people and he calls them Israel. And he gives them instructions for how they are to behave, the people of Israel. And a lot of what he says to them is he says, okay, you need to make sure that you take some time to celebrate. So one of the 10 commandments is have a day off, have a Sabbath. That's a pretty good commandment, especially if you have been a slave. I'm so committed to this commandment that if you don't take a day off, I'm going to get some people to kill you. That's basically what he says. And then once a week they're to have a day off. Then it's like once every 7 years. I was amazed when I found this out. Every 7 years, the people of Israel were to stop farming. And because most of them would have made their living from farming, basically 1 year in every 7, they had to have off. And they just had to trust that the land would produce food for them. 3 times every year, they had to stop all their work and they all had to go to Jerusalem for a knees up, for a massive celebration, to rejoice in who God was and to party. So 3 times a year, put all your stuff down, let's all head down to Jerusalem and we're all going to celebrate. Once every 50 years, they had something called the Year of Jubilee. And when the Year of Jubilee happened, you would have your normal traditional year off, because once every 7 years you had a year off. And then you would have to have a second whole year off, where you weren't allowed to farm the land. And not only would that happen, but in the Year of Jubilee, what Israel were meant to do is they were effectively meant to hit reset on their economy. And so all the land, which of course over time inevitably ends up in the hands of a few wealthy people, would get redistributed according to how it was originally allotted to the tribes of Israel. So suddenly, that's not good news if you're one of the few rich, but if you're not, then that's an incredible year, because you're like, oh my word, all my debts are about to get cancelled and all the land is going to get redistributed. This is a good thing that's happening. It's a party year. God, the God of joy, said, this is how I want you to live, to reflect me to the world around you. And if that wasn't enough, he finally, eventually became one of us. Jesus, the most joyful being in the universe, becomes flesh. And because of the suffering of Jesus and because of the significance of that, sometimes I wonder if we miss the deep well of joy that lay beneath everything that he was doing. And so when he comes into the world, how does it begin? The angel appears above the shepherds and the sheep and says, hello everybody, I bring you good news of great joy for all people. And then a whole backing choir of angels jumps out from behind the clouds and they start singing, peace to everyone on earth. And then beneath them, Jesus is born and he comes with joy and he brings joy. And so when he starts his ministry in Luke chapter 4, what he does is he goes into the synagogue in the town and he says this. Luke chapter 4, verse 18, he reads from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom from the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Do you know what the year of the Lord's favor is? The year of Jubilee. That's what it meant. It's a year that Israel were commanded to celebrate, but there's no record they ever did. Well, Jesus says, I'm coming and we're going to celebrate this. This is going to be the cancellation of debts. This is going to turn the world upside down. And so if you're in prison or if you're blind or if you're oppressed or if you're poor, joy has just walked into the synagogue and announced that he has arrived, that his ministry has begun. And yes, Jesus confronts people and he confronts the powers of darkness and he's fierce in his justice. But he really was bringing rejoicing everywhere that he went. And he said to his people, he said to his disciples, John 15 verse 11, these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. And so for us, what this doesn't mean is, okay, we are meant to be joyful. Let's all try harder. That's my approach almost always. I just think if I grit my teeth, I can maybe do this. What I discovered to my surprise is that if you grit your teeth, you don't become more joyful. You can't just be like, haha, that's such a funny joke, I'm really enjoying this. It just doesn't happen. But what I found is what cannot be forced can be cultivated. And when we come to know the God that we know, then what happens is he begins to live inside of us, as we've not just talked about this week, but experienced afresh for ourselves. The Holy Spirit dwells in us. The fruit of the Spirit, we're told, is love, joy, and then the others. Joy. And so if I gave you a pot of soil and said, grow a plant just from this pot of soil, it would be impossible, no matter how hard you tried, to force something to grow. But when there's a seed inside of the pot and I give it to you, then what you can do is you can cultivate the life that's in there. And for us, when we understand this, we can appreciate that actually, although I can't force supernatural joy into my life, I can recognize that the Spirit of God is living inside of me. And so it is possible for me to cultivate the joy that he is wanting for me to walk into. It's what a guy called Richard Foster calls the discipline of celebration. The discipline of celebration. what we'll do as we as we pursue this is we will discover the benefits of joy, and there are tremendous benefits. Nehemiah, when he's talking to the people in Jerusalem, when they're in the middle of a rebuilding project and they have the law read to them, they start to cry. And Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 10 says, he says to the people, "Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks, and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to our Lord." By the way, that's where the word holiday comes from. Holy day. This word is holy to our Lord. "Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." The joy of the Lord is your strength. So I know for me, I'm thinking, well, we're going home again. There's going to be all the challenges that come with just, life. I mean, we won't be drowning on a campsite, but there will be tough things happening. And how are we going to keep going? How are we going to persevere? One way that's really important, one way that's incredibly life-giving, is to understand and appreciate this truth that the joy of the Lord is our strength. Joy gives us strength. Anyone here, I know we don't normally respond by putting our hands up, anyone here begun to learn an instrument? Ever just started learning an instrument? Give me a wave. Okay, now put your hands down if you're still playing it. So almost all of those hands are still up. What we did is we all started learning the instruments. For me, it was the flute. I have no idea why. And we stopped, yeah? Why? Because there was no joy almost. It's really hard to keep going if you're not enjoying something. And one of the things that I've been discovering over the years is joy, it gives you an endurance, but also part of the reason it does that is because it gives you perspective. It helps us appreciate the good and the bad in life. It helps us to sometimes just shake things off. One of the things that I've found over the years is life can be going really hard and then something happens that just causes me to crack up. And nothing has changed, but it feels like it has. I remember, this is a completely random thing, but I remember a little while ago, Mike and Beth and I were in a restaurant together in Malaysia, and the waitress was treating me really weird, and I couldn't understand why. Until she said, a bit later on in the meal, she explained how she thought the relationship between the three of us actually worked. And she genuinely thought, this is completely true, that Mike was married to Beth and that I was their son. And I remember being like, what kind of weird, I don't even understand that. I don't even understand how you can think that. How old do you think I am? Or how young, and I remember I was getting quite cross as she went on, and Beth just didn't really know what to make of it. And Mike was loving it. My word. And he started telling her all these stories that he was making up about how when I was 12, I used to wet the bed and just had a whale of a time. And and although I was a bit cross, obviously it was quite funny as well. What we find is that, life can be so heavy sometimes. You can have such a tough week, and then you meet up with a friend and you have a good belly laugh, even if it's just at yourself. And doesn't it feel like medicine? Doesn't it feel different? There's a reason for that, because joy gives us strength. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 13 says, "A happy heart makes the face cheerful, but heartache crushes the spirit." There's real benefits to the serious business of joy. And even if we weren't convinced by the benefits, unfortunately, we don't have a choice, because we are actually commanded to rejoice. So Paul says this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again, rejoice. He's writing that, by the way, from prison. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. So how? If we think, okay, God's joyful. There's an invitation there for us to cultivate the joy that he implants into us, that is living inside of us through his presence. How can I cultivate that? What could I do to partner with him in this process of transformation? I just want to suggest 4 things that we could do to finish. The first one is this. You want to begin to cultivate joy. And not all of these might be for all of us, but maybe one of them would ring true for you as a thing that we could put into practice as we look to go home. First one, now is the only time to celebrate. Now is the only time to celebrate. So Psalm 118, verse 24 says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." That was another old classic back in the day. This is the day that they just nick this stuff from the Bible. Anyway, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us be glad and rejoice in it. Now, what he doesn't say is yesterday was the day the Lord made, and wasn't that great? And tomorrow will be a day that the Lord will make, and let's look forward to that. He says, this is the day that the Lord has made, so let us be glad and rejoice in it. And many of us, what we do is we with our attitude to joy, is we take this approach, and I do it. When everything's sorted, then I'll rejoice. So when all the pieces are in place and my life is going how my life is meant to be going, then I will rejoice. But until I get to that stage, I'm not going to rejoice. The danger with that, the risk with that, is that life just happens, and the reality is it's never perfect. And so if we're not careful, then we can spend the whole of life waiting for the perfect conditions in which to rejoice and find ourselves never rejoicing. So I know some of us are at school, but for the rest of us, do you remember when you were at school and it was like, oh my word, I cannot wait until I finish school. And I do not have to sit another exam. It's going to be amazing. They're not going to make me study chemistry anymore. I just can't wait to get out of here and get a job. And then you leave school and you get a job and you're like, oh my word, I had it so good in school. I used to have 6 weeks off. I used to, and I just had to worry about a few things like this. And now I've got all of this to deal with, and they give me 4 weeks a year. Like, what is with that? And I hate my job, and my career is not going well. Or we can think about our relationships. You can think when we're single, okay, well, maybe if I get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, then I'll be happy. And then, I'll be able to really enjoy my life. And then you end up getting a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you think after, well, do you know what? I am happy, but they're telling me what to do quite a lot. And, she's telling me what to wear, and he's telling me what to watch. And maybe it will change if we get married. And so you get married, and you think, oh my word, 2 weeks in, the perfect person that I married doesn't seem quite as perfect as they were on the wedding day. And they seem to be thinking the same thing about me. Oh gosh, we're in this forever now. And then you think, well, maybe we'll be happy if we have some kids. And so you have kids, and you think, what were we thinking? We used to have days off. I used to get up at 8 o'clock and think that was early. Now it's 5 a.m. every single day. I'm changing nappies constantly. And so we say to ourselves, well, maybe when we get through this phase, maybe when they become teenagers, it will be easier. Yes. And then you become a parent of teenagers and you think, what was I thinking? I used to have the problem of waking up to change a nappy at 2 a.m. and now I'm up at 2 a.m. thinking, where the heck are they? They were meant to be home 2 hours ago. And we think maybe it will be easier when they go to university. And they go to university and you realize, what was I thinking? This is costing me an absolute fortune. They only come back with dirty laundry. Maybe it will be easier when they finish university. And then they finish and they can't get on the property ladder. So they come back and they live in your house and you think, what was I thinking? This is never going to end. And then eventually they hit 45 and they've saved up enough money for a deposit, and so they leave home. And then you think, oh man, do you remember when the kids were around all the time? And the house was full, and now it's not. And you end up with what they call empty nest syndrome. And then they have grandchildren and they bring them over to your house and you think, what were we thinking? What were we thinking? We're not young like we used to. We don't have the energy that I can't do this anymore. And then the grandchildren aren't interested anymore. And you think, oh, do you remember when they used to come over and they used to eat our cakes and that was like a real treat? And then you die. I'm serious. There is a real danger that if we don't learn to rejoice in today, we will never learn to rejoice. And seriously, there are always going to be reasons not to. We can say, how can we rejoice? How can we rejoice with all the pain in the world? And what I'm not saying is that we treat that flippantly, or that we wear some kind of plastic smile, this kind of like bizarre, fake Christian positivity. That's not what I'm saying. We be real. But one of the things that I've noticed is some of the people that work most closely with those who are suffering, some of the believers that do that, they have a joy about them that is just magnetic. Mother Teresa, she was known for that. She was right there at the coalface with people who are struggling with some of the worst things that any human being can go through. And yet there was a joy to her. And what that meant was she actually had something to bring. What that meant was she was actually hope when it was hopeless and light in the darkness. Someone said to me once, suffering is inevitable, but celebration is a choice. Now is the only time we can rejoice. Second thing that we can do to learn to cultivate, and I say this to myself as much as to anybody else in this room, probably more so. Get over your selfie. This is the selfie generation, right? The selfie time. And what we do constantly, of course, is check ourselves out and think about ourselves. And what Jesus says to a bunch of stressed out people in the Sermon on the Mount when he's telling them not to worry is he says, look at the birds of the air. Look at the flower of the fields. Implication being he's done both. And then he says, and look at your Father in heaven. Just look at him for a bit. And it's like flip the camera around. Rather than having it yourself, flip it around and see what you can see through the lens, or better yet, put it down, and you'll discover that all around you are reasons to celebrate. I remember reading this book by a guy called John Ortberg who was talking about his little kid, Mallory. And he said that they used to have in their house, in the Ortberg house, what they called a Dee-Dar day, which is really just like a fun day. And he remembers this time where he was bathing his little girl, and she got out the bath and she started running around in circles going, it's a Dee-Dar day, it's a Dee-Dar day, it's a Dee-Dar day. And he was like, a bit frustrated. He wanted to get into the next part of his day. So he just said, come on, Mallory, just go a bit faster. And she misunderstood what he said. And she started going, it's a Dee-Dar day, it's a Dee-Dar day, it's a Dee-Dar day. And he said, no, that's not what I meant. I mean, come on, we've got to get on to the next thing. And she just looked at him and said, why? And he realized he had no answer. He just, it was like, oh. And there's this thing about kids that have this wonderful ability to almost exult in monotony, in doing the same thing. Have you ever had a little kid, like a nephew or a niece, come up to you and say, hey, can you throw me in the air? And you go, okay, throw them in the air. And then they go, do it again. Throw them in the air, do it again. And you can keep going until your arms are dropping off, and they'll still say, do it again. And one writer, G.K. Chesterton, he said that God is a little bit like that. In this sense, it's almost like he's got the eternal appetite of infancy. Chesterton says maybe God just says every morning to the sun, do it again, and every evening to the moon, do it again. Maybe he makes every daisy individually, not because he can't think of another way to make a daisy, but just because he loves to do it. He says that we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we are. That we sit alone in a starry chamber of silence while all around us the laughter of heaven is too loud for us to hear. Do it again. And what the discipline of celebration is not hedonism. It's not pursuing pleasure for its own sake. I need to find something new and something novel, a bigger car, a better house, a new bit of clothing or whatever. It's not pursuing something novel. What it is it's learning to enjoy all the things that are around us that we missed the first time around. I don't know if any of you have seen that film About Time. But if you haven't seen it, some of you have. If you haven't, spoiler alert, basically, it's about this guy who, when he's 20, 21, his dad sits him down and tells him the family secret. And the family secret is, for whatever reason, the men in this family can travel back in time, but not to any point in history. They can only travel back to another point in their own life. And so the story really kind of plays out with him trying to work out, how do I use this ability that I now have to travel back in time? And his dad gives him some advice. And his dad says, look, what you don't want to do is use it to go after money. People have tried that, it doesn't work. What you don't want to do is use it to go after fame. That'll be a complete disaster. He says, this is what I've discovered, okay? This is how to do it, how to make the most of it. What you do is you just live a day, just a normal day, go to work and do all that stuff. And then, at the end of the day, travel back to the beginning of the very same day and live it all over again. But this time, notice all the things that you missed the first time around because you were too much of a stress head. And so you see him do that. So he lives this day, and he's kind of like, he's a barrister, and you see him running through kind of like a station in London, rushing to get to his court case, and he ends up winning his court case and goes, yeah. And then he kind of like, he goes off to grab some lunch, and he just rushes in to Pret and grabs a sandwich and rushes back out again. And he ends up kind of sitting on the tube on the way home, and this person's there listening to really loud music, and he's like, oh my word, and just collapses into his house at the end of the day. And then he decides, I'm going to do it again. So he goes and he travels back to the beginning of exactly the same day. And this time, some moving music comes on in the background. So it already feels like a better day. And he, rather than rushing through this train station, he starts looking at the architecture everywhere and being like, wow, have you seen that? Have you seen that? And this time when he wins his court case, he literally kind of like jumps in the air and punches it and hugs the guy that he won the case for. This time when he goes into Pret-a-Manger, they change the angle of the camera so that you see the face of the girl who's serving him, and she smiles at him, and they have a moment of human connection while he gets his sandwich. This time when he sits on the train on the way home, he hears the music of the guy next to him, and he starts playing air guitar along. And this time at the end of his day, when his wife says, how's your day gone? He says, it's gone great, and I'm hesitant to say this to you, but then they start having sex in a way that they wouldn't have done the first day around. I don't want you to think the key to this is, this is the key to more sex or anything like that, but this is what happens in the film. And then the film goes on with him learning to kind of like get the handle on this power, and then there's a moment at the end of the film that I cannot get out of my head. And he says, as they're playing it, he says, I've gone one step further than Dad. Now I don't travel back in time at all, not even for the day. I just try to live each day as if I've deliberately come back to this one day to enjoy it, as if it were the full, final day of my extraordinary, ordinary life. And I remember seeing it and thinking, that is a great way to try and do this. And it was at a time where we just had our first son, and he was waking up at 5 a.m. And I would sit there sometimes early in the morning with Josiah on my knee, and I would look at him, and I would say, Josiah, I have decided to live this day as if I've deliberately come back to this one day, to enjoy it, as if it is the full, final day of my extraordinary, ordinary life. And he would go, which I think meant, go for it, Dad. Learn to appreciate everything around. Take your eyes off yourself and look at the world. It's pregnant with things that we can rejoice in. Every tick of the clock is a gift from God. Third way that we can cultivate joy in us is develop a rhythm of celebration. Just work it in. I'm not going to take ages on this one, but it's just work it into the rhythm of life. That's what God says to the people of Israel do. You know what? Once a week, do this. 3 times a year, do this. Once every few years, do this. And Beth and I have worked hard at this since we began to discover it's there in Scripture. And, one of the things that we've done is we try to appreciate the difference between a day off and a day of rest. A day off is generally where most of us take some time off work to do all the stuff that we got to do in life, but we're not paid to do it, like laundry and shopping and cleaning and all that stuff. And we've actually just put into our week a day where we're just going to totally rest, and we squash everything else into the other 6. So for us, Monday is always a day of celebration. Not because it's a big thing where we do loads of things, but where we deliberately don't do very many things. We wrote a list of things that we will not do on what is for us our little day of rest. We will not do chores. We won't cook, so we factored into our budget that we'll get a takeaway. And we tried to work it out. And so Monday always looks for us like this time of replenishment and enjoyment and refreshment. Often on a Monday, because Mike has the same day off as we do, we'll get together and we'll hang out with Pilav. Often we will go to restaurants. That's what he does for his celebration. And I will explain while the waitress is taking our drinks order that I am married to Beth, and I'm not the weird love child of Mike and Beth. But that's how we do it. And how do you do it? What are your ways? What are your rhythms of celebration? I've already planned my kids' birthday parties well in advance. They're going to be utterly humiliated and probably completely hate them, but I'll enjoy it. Because I want to embarrass them, and I want to celebrate them, and I want to cheer, champion them and cheer them on and all of that. So find rhythms. It's fascinating to me that Jesus, who had 3 years to save the world, seems to spend an awful lot of his time at barbecues on the beach and at parties and taking naps. He does that a lot. Fourth way, final way that we can cultivate joy and celebration in our lives is this: remember how it all ends. There's a lady called Brené Brown who's done a lot of stuff about joy and vulnerability. She's got a talk on Netflix that I watched the other day. And one of the things she says in this talk is she says that often joy is this vulnerable emotion that we don't always allow ourselves to feel because we're so afraid that it's going to disappear. And she talks about how sometimes what can happen is parents can sit there watching their child sleeping and then instantly begin to dress rehearse tragedy and begin to imagine all these things that can go wrong. I don't know if you've ever done that in your child's life. Or that we can suddenly one day wake up and think, hang on a second, everything in my life is pretty good right now. You know, I'm enjoying it. Like, it seems to be going well at work or at school. It seems to be going well with my friends. Like, you know, I'm enjoying my life. And then the very next thing we think is, uh-oh, it's just a matter of time till the other shoe drops. And we imagine and we dress rehearse tragedy. And I would say, as Jesus' people, you know, one of the things that we want to be thinking about, imagining and dress rehearsing, is the end that we're given as a concrete, definite end to this phase of creation, which is that when heaven invades earth, all things will be put right. C.S. Lewis said that our first word when we get to heaven will be the word, oh. With an air of, now I understand. Oh, now I get it. Your goodness and your compassion and your generosity. Now I see it. Well, we don't have to wait till we get there to celebrate it now. And we're given this picture of the future in the book of Revelation, where we're told, Revelation chapter 21, verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. And what this does not mean is that we sit around saying, don't worry, it's all going to be okay in the end. What it means is we get this picture of the future, and we as the people of God are called to build the future now. And so we say, look, if it's not good enough for the future picture of Revelation, if there are tears, then our role is to wipe them from people's eyes. And if there's mourning and crying, then our role is to bring comfort. And if there's suffering and if there's poverty, then our role is to go and stand there and bring relief to it. If it's not good enough for then it isn't good enough for now. And yet at the same time, we can do it with this deep inner well of joy because we know how it's all going to end. Have you ever watched a sports match where you're watching it live and it's like nail biting and your team is losing and are they going to come back and do that and you don't know and it's all this up and down? Have you ever watched a replay where you already know the score, and so you can sit there through all the ups and downs with this deep inner peace that they will score in the last minute? I know what is going to happen. That is the life of a Christian. It's not fantasy, it's concrete hope. Isaiah prophesied this, and he did it in Isaiah 55, verse 12. And I'll finish with this. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. We follow a God who is joy in his very core. And as we look to follow him, we are going on a journey of cultivating that joy and sharing it with the world around us. This is good news.